let's get started with our second panel and move from cybersecurity, the cyber domain, into global threats and countering violent extremists, rogue actors, and threats to the homeland. Time and again, we've seen terrorist attacks that capture the world's attention, whether referring to the Al-Qaeda attacks on 9/11, the so-called Islamic State's attempt to build the caliphate in Syria, and the increasingly common murders perpetrated by white supremacists here in the United States. One thing seems to be true. There is a war being fought, and we must respond systematically, effectively, and creatively if we are to address these critical threats. The panel will seek to address those today, and unfortunately, our moderator, Dr. Murray, is stuck in Kansas City. But we're very lucky to have Luke Knittig, who is to step in and serve on 2 panels as the moderator. You can see Luke's credentials in the media guide, but let me tell you, he is the Senior Director of Communications at the McCain Institute, and he was the former U.S. Chief Spokesperson for Afghanistan and ISAF. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome Luke to the stage as our moderator today.
Proud to be back here for the second year, proud to be here as part of the McCain Institute. We talk about being in the arena as, what you can do and how you can catch up, and it's quite good to be out of Washington at the moment, quite honest. And it's humbling to see so many people get up early on a Saturday morning and come out and engage, and to me that is in the arena. We couldn't have had a much better scene setter and then some to talk about global threats. I think he kind of touched on all the topics of this panel: countering violent extremism, rogue actors, and threats to the homeland, and of course, much more. I'm an optimist. I guess, you could think about moderating a panel like this and think, my gosh, these are big, daunting, scary kind of things, and I think they are. But when you look at the panelists we have here, and I submit the folks that we have in the room, you have the right people and will to take on these threats, and we'll kind of get into it with our panel. You have their full bio there. I'm just going to highlight a few things. I'll start with Brian Turner. We're West Point classmates, which I think is pretty neat. He's gone on and done some really amazing things. I mean, he is an agent in the FBI. He's spent very interesting time overseas in global operations, and I think that'll be super germane. He spent time in Phoenix. He spent time in Minneapolis. He is steeped in what it means to be on the ground taking on these threats. So I think you'll agree that perspective is terribly important in how we're approaching this. And then I'll turn to Ambassador Jenkins, who can come at this from so many different angles as well. We should talk about what her current position is right now, because it's super useful for everybody to know. She is the founder and president of the Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation. So grab onto that for a minute and how important that is. But then you go back and look at her ambassadorial responsibilities in the past. Counselor to the 9/11 Commission, on the scene for more than half a decade, taking on threat reduction as part of the lead for the State Department. There's a real public health and the threats background there, weapons of mass destruction. I could go on and on. She's affiliated with Brookings. Maybe General Allen will be talking about her more in that capacity in a little bit. So, okay, probably overdoing the introductions here. But Farah, besides writing a book, How We Win, because if you're like me and you're an optimist, you want to know how do you win, worked in 3 different administrations. I hope I'm not selling you short there. A bona fide expert on countering violent extremism. I get to go to a few things in Washington and other places, and everybody listens when she shows up and talks, and so we're in for a treat to hear her here. Probably selling your bio short as well, but I think we should get into it. So we've had the scene set by David Sanger. I know we'll have questions. We're going to kind of do the standard format. But I guess I would ask each from your perspective to give an opening statement, and we'll pick up from there. Let's go right down the line.
Sure. First and foremost, it's an honor to be here with this panel, and thanks for everyone for taking time on Saturday to spend some time with us. Yeah, I've been in the FBI about 17 and a half years, continue to serve the country. And one of the things that still continues to remain within the FBI is the #1 priority regarding terrorism. Terrorism in terms of protecting Americans from terrorist attacks, both domestic and international. So I just wanted to put that out there, that this continues to be our #1 priority. Recognizing that, we've also recognized the fact that that threat has evolved. It's been a while since 9/11. That threat still exists where you have terrorist organizations, foreign terrorist organizations that actually plan and resource complex attacks against the United States and its interests abroad. But a subset of that has been essentially something that's called homegrown violent extremists. Those individuals that are sitting within the confines of the United States who become radicalized. Those folks who are radicalized have no established profile, both genders, various age groups, and they're radicalized for different reasons. That in turn presents a challenge that we have not only at the FBI but as the US government to try to continue to do that. So just to kind of set the stage for the conversation, those homegrown violent extremists are one of 2 buckets of threat that we deal with in the last couple of years. The homegrown violent extremists, and then another term we use is domestic radicalized individuals. So I'll kind of throw that out there as opening comments, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues up here.
Thanks.
Great, thanks. I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me here today. It's really a great honor to be here and to hear from all the excellent panelists and speakers. I'm looking forward to a good discussion. I think for me, I'm going to break the issue of threats into 2 different areas. We're talking about weapons of mass destruction, and of course, we want to focus here on nuclear weapons. Of course, we know that there's still thousands of nuclear weapons that exist. The US and Russia, of course, has the large number of nuclear weapons, so that in itself is a threat. But also we know that we're trying to work with countries like North Korea. We have concerns about Iran as well, and there's always a concern about other countries who may have an interest in developing these weapons. And so we've seen from the news how difficult it is to work these issues, and the fact that we really are still living with the threat of nuclear weapons. And by having nuclear weapons, you're concerned about such things as safety and security. A lot of the work that I did during the Obama administration was looking at the issue of vulnerable nuclear material and trying to secure that material. Because what's happened, if we talk about evolution, is very much when I started working on these issues in the 1990s, a lot of the focus was on states. And then we started to talk more about non-state actors getting their hands on nuclear material that they could use to develop a weapon of mass destruction. And what we've been seeing now is that we're turning back a lot more to issues of states, and we're focusing a lot more on Iran and North Korea. So the threat of states never went away. It just wasn't as much of a focus after 9/11, but now we're back to where we were before. And essentially we're dealing with 2 threats, the state and the non-state actor. And of course, both of those threats require different ways in which we try to address them. But also, secondly, there's another threat, and that's really the threat of where are we and what are we doing in terms of weapons of mass destruction issues, particularly nuclear weapons. As many of you know, we withdrew from the INF Treaty, which was a treaty that we had with Russia, where we were able to destroy a complete class of missiles, short-range missiles. And then there's also the Do Start Treaty, which will be expiring if we don't extend it with Russia. That will expire in 2021. And also there's a concern about an increase in nuclear weapons development now with Russia and the US. So we're back to that issue as well. So we're really in a situation where we really don't have significant strategies for how we're going to address these issues. There's no real overall strategy for how the US is going to deal with nuclear weapons issues. We have a lot of individual ideas for how we deal with different countries. But the real talk right now in the arms control community is where are we and what are we doing? What is our strategy? And what are we doing going forward, particularly in light of the fact that there is a real concern about developing new weapons at a time when we really should be going toward getting rid of these weapons. So I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to get a little bit serious about the 18 years after 9/11 and the quality of attention that we've paid on how people get radicalized, which is the work that I've been doing and been fortunate enough to be able to do over both the Bush and Obama administrations. And knowing how hard and fast we work to keep our country safe. On the Knittig side, I have been extremely shocked to see that 18 years after 9/11, we have not been able to move the non-Knittig to a place where we are moving in a direction of success. The book, How We Win, is indeed an optimistic title, but it's not airy-fairy. It is based on the realization that there are solutions that are available and affordable right now. So when I think about sort of how we look at the ideological fight, how do we make sure that young people, and that's actually what we're dealing with, youth, it's a youth protection position that we're taking. What are the threats we know? And what are the threats we don't know? In fact, what are we preparing for, and what are we not preparing for? And so when I look at our posture on the preparedness side, we keep saying the same things, we keep expecting our adversaries to be the same way, and we keep expecting things to stay status quo. What do I mean by that? We did not quite understand that a group like the so-called Islamic State was going to be born and surge, but we also had wrong expectations about why young people get radicalized and the way they do. So we haven't put the kind of attention into that. We came very late to the game. I'm going to push back slightly on my colleague. I don't look at the ideological threat from the position of international versus domestic. There's no such thing from my perspective. The us versus them ideology exists globally. We're sitting in a room with flags around the world. Millennials and Generation Z, with a finger swipe, are connected to each other in ways that I don't need to tell you. We just had a great panel with David and heard about the cyber threat. That connectivity means that ideology has no borders. So when we look at what we're facing right now, we're facing a global threat. We're not facing a domestic versus an international threat. We are seeing non-state actors learn from each other. So whether they're white supremacists or the so-called Islamic State, you are seeing them learn from the playbooks from each other and understanding how to build their new armies. That's the threat we know. The threat we don't know, and the thing that terrifies me the most, my work hasn't been around extremists that use ideology based on neo-Nazis or white supremacists or identitarians. That's not the work that I've done. The work that I've focused on are non-state actors that use Islam to radicalize for their nefarious ends. So groups like AQ, the Taliban, Shabab, Boko Haram, the Taliban, that are looking at one dimension of possible new armies, and that's the demographic of young people under the age of 30 that have some sort of affiliation somehow in their identity around being Muslim. And that number is huge. There are 1 billion Muslims under the age of 30 on planet Earth today. That goes to 1.2 by the year 2030. That's the threat we have not yet accounted for. What does that actually mean? So when I look at what the scope of this discussion in terms of global threats and what we're facing, the ideology stuff is very hard to put your hands around. It's very hard to understand. You can't quite connect the dots why something that happens in Trinidad and Tobago actually is connected to something that's happening in Tajikistan, because we as a government have not connected those dots. But if we step back and look at the threat profile for the world as it will be built demographically, we are very far behind in our ability to not just build a strategy for where we are and where we must go, but the resourcing, the personnel, and the imagination for what is to come.
So with those opening statements, let me pick up on a few points, put a few things into play, and maybe we go back down the line, or we'll decide how to jump in. This idea of international versus domestic, or it's not, or global, kind of captivates me. Some of you would have seen last year, I hope, Nick Rasmussen, who used to run the National Counterterror Center and is with us now, speak. And I hear him and others say, gosh, you know, do we have the right people around the table on the domestic side? He felt fairly confident that for international happenings in the Situation Room that we were getting better, or we're pretty good at having the right people around the table, but then other things would happen, to your point, be like, gosh, do we have the right people around the table, or the right connectivity? Now, I haven't fully caught up to it, but I know that Department of Homeland Security has announced a new framework for how to get at some of this in the homeland just a couple of weeks ago, so maybe it's logical to start with you on that. But when I talk to people, they say, you know, there's some real promise there. It goes to resources, other things as far as the aspirational aspects of it and how it plays out, but is it tied to a larger strategy? And then, of course, when you talk about putting the right people around the table domestically, you also have a lot of other issues that come into play, you know, rights, et cetera. So I guess let's just go down the line and pick up on anything you heard on the opening statement, and then a little bit on that.
Yeah, I want to recognize what, thanks for bringing that up, Farah, about the scope in which they're not, the world is not so perfect that everything's in an exact bucket. So your point's well taken. I think in an effort to try to, you know, I'm kind of dating myself here. There was a movie years ago called Minority Report, where the focus of the book, Tom Cruise, if y'all ever a Tom Cruise fan, was always the premise of the stories was to get in front of something before it happened. And that continues to be the mindset when we're trying to deal with terrorist activity. That being said, Farah brought up a really good point. You know, our society, our country is as diverse as it ever has been. And I think in an effort to get ahead of that is to bolster, even within the scope of the FBI, the community outreach efforts. Not only in terms of building dialogue, because with dialogue comes trust and mutual respect, but also even in recruitment efforts, in terms of, you know, the most effective agencies are able to do their job if they, you know, closely represent the communities in which they serve. And that is something that we're trying to contend with in the last few years, is to really push that effort as well. Also, the two, though, going back to building the trust and respect, there are a lot of folks who have come into the United States, frankly, over the last 20 years, who come from regions of the world that where law enforcement doesn't have a good reputation, that they're corrupt. So they come here to the United States and frankly are guarded. And we have to make an effort to kind of break down those walls, to develop that ability to have that dialogue, so that those communities, in addition to the traditional communities that have existed, were better postured to basically, you know, which I'll talk about later on, the see something, say something dynamic. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues on that note.
Thanks. I guess I would start by asking a question is, who are the right people? When we say the right people around the table, I mean, I know in the area of weapons of mass destruction, for example, which I've been working in for almost 30 years now, it's not, dealing with I talk about the lack of a strategy. I can say that it's not a very diverse field in terms of who's at the table. And really we're at a point where, as I said, we're asking ourselves the question of what's the future of arms control in light of where we are now, and some of the questions that we're trying to find out answers to, is an opportunity to get the right people around the table, right people being, you know, different voices who represent the U.S. And looking at the strategies that we have had for so many years since the 1940s, and is that the right strategy, and are we missing things by not having more people around the table? And taking this opportunity to do that right. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that we're actually doing that. I think there's discussion about the importance of it, but what we're actually doing about that, I'm not so sure. That's one of the things that my organization is trying to do, is increase some of that diverse voices, so that the strategies that we have for the weapons of mass destruction in the future may not be the same that we had before, but they may not need to be. We may need to have something different, and we can help to make sure it's different by having different people there. Also, just in general, I teach a course at Georgetown, and it's called U.S. Foreign Policy and Global Threats. And the premise of the course is just that in order to deal with global threats, including weapons of mass destruction, You not only need to have diverse voices, but you also need to have different ways in which we approach these issues. Because these issues are interrelated. There are no real domestic, global separations anymore when you talk about issues, not just weapons of mass destruction or terrorism, but also things like climate change and food and water security. All these other traditionally considered quote-unquote human security issues are now becoming, in my view, more national security issues and things that we need to really be thinking about and focusing on and developing a strategy for how we deal with that. And unfortunately, the U.S. is not really set up to do that. Not only do we not have a strategy, we don't have the systems and the way in which the government needs to be set up to do that. It's still very traditional with the barriers and the silos, and also Congress has the barriers and the silos. So how we deal with these global threats, including nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. There's a lot of questions how we deal with those things, but we have to start off by having different voices and different ways and different processes.
So when I look at how we're positioned at the moment in government to think about these kinds of things and the threats that we're facing, I have seen things move both in the hard power domain and the soft power domain, looking at the world as if we're still in the Cold War and designing a system for the future that's based on what we've done in the past. And the fact is that in the 21st century, the world is turned upside down for a lot of different reasons, and government hasn't in fact caught up with it. One of the ideas that I put forward in my book is a concept that I talk about, which is really a derivative of soft power that's called open power. It's really opening up the aperture for solutions and thinking differently, because I found that when I was special representative to Muslim communities at the State Department in the Obama administration, we kept, the answer that we're trying to build, the programs, the initiatives, was always in this one way that we would go forward because we've done this before. We know how to do grants in this way. We know that we didn't have any imagination. So when you ask the question about who needs to be around that table for both a 50-state plan here in the United States on how to prepare and build prevention tools and inoculate society so that kids don't get recruited, or in an international framework where we can think about partnerships and what we need to do, we got to think about who's around that table, not just from the diversity within the interagency, but who are the people we would bring to the table to help us think differently about the threat that we're facing. We have not included anthropologists and ethnographers. We have not included historians, which may sound absolutely insane to most people, but in fact, the cultural component of what we're seeing around youth really matters to their identity and their belonging. And we need to understand, we need to have things at our fingertips that will aid us in the design and the implementation of the programs to stop the appeal of the ideology. So that's one component. The other, and I'm looking at General Allen here, we were both lucky enough to be together at Jay Johnson's advisory council on countering, the task force, on countering violent extremism. We worked together on that, and the plan in 2016 that we gave forward was in fact to include something that had not been included at scale in any way in our government were mental health experts, the social sciences that need to be applied to how we think about how young people think about their identity as they're growing up. A human brain doesn't develop until the age of 24. What do we know about every aspect of the development for a young person, and what signals make a difference to that young person to make them want to become a white supremacist or an advocate for the so-called Islamic State? How are we bringing in the science to help us as government think through that? So when you ask the question about who's around the table, I think we have to open up the aperture. We have to think differently and creatively about what we need to do, and we need to be clear that the kind of paths that we built for the threats that we faced in the past cannot help us in making sure that we are ready for the threats that are currently on planet Earth right now and what will be in the years ahead. And we have to do something dramatic, not just speak about it, but actually do something. And so my last point is, all of this discussion is terrific, but if you don't have a leader and you don't have a vision on the ideological component of this fight, we will never get to where we need to be. And in the last 18 years since 9/11, Every single president, the 3 presidents that have existed since 9/11, have all talked about the importance of ideology, but there has never been an implementation within our government of somebody who's actually all day, every day in charge of that ideological fight. We have somebody who's in charge of the kinetic fight. We have nobody who's in charge of the non-kinetic fight. And so I would say in all of this, as you're building a strategy and you have DHS or state or whoever you think should be writing the strategy, it cannot be deployed unless you have the leadership and the vision and the commitment that we are actually going to do soft power as hard as we're going to do hard power.
There's actually, to your point, Farah, there's actually something that we have in the Bureau throughout the country recognizing that, particularly the mental health piece. So we have joint terrorism task forces in all 56 field offices throughout the country. Historically, that was always a multi-agency, a bunch of 3-letter agencies, local, state partners, and it was basically a law enforcement construct. In the last couple of years, we've actually been incorporating mental health professionals as far as collaborating with the joint terrorism task forces throughout the country, recognizing that there's value added to trying to get ahead of that threat. I put that out for the group because I think, at least from the FBI's perspective, that joint terrorism task force is really kind of the action arm to help us as need be to modify our approach in respect to whatever the asymmetric threat may be, because terrorism, the dynamic of the terrorist threat today is different than it was 2 days after 9/11. So I think if we put that kind of flexibility within those in that organization, I think we'll be set up for success in the future.
I want to change gears, but I want to make one point on that is, I think more people should catch up with that if they haven't, but we can't just leave it to the FBI. I know you aren't, it's communities, but I think there's a real role for the private sector and a lot of folks to come in just, for one reason. If it's the FBI that shows up and says, hey, I want to have a conversation, that sometimes has a chilling effect right from the start, that other partners coming in and helping with you on that. But I want to pick up on, I was at the Special Operations Policy Forum last week, and somebody said something that kind of caught my attention. We're talking about outreach and diversity. Reach is important, and capability is important. Certainly special operations represent that in a powerful way. Being able to act globally to stop bad guys and do the things that we need to do. Someone talked about there, we're very good at putting warheads to foreheads when we need to. And that sounds kind of flip, but I think it's probably pretty important to have that kind of hard power capability. But then I hear a lot of talk of what Farah was talking about, what are the other pieces underneath that? You can go in and be very successful somewhere in putting down a threat, putting down a bad guy or a group of bad guys, but then the underlying environment allows other global actors to come in and do things that aren't as ideologically or common values based as we would like to see. So I think I'll throw this one to Ambassador Jenkins. I mean, even as we focus on what needs to happen on extremism and I think hopefully starting to accept that these things span boundaries, I'm struck by WMD, a lot of really just bad hard power things are out there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I emphasize is, going back to these other actors, is the kind of threats we're dealing with, and that includes the hard stuff, the WMD. These are not issues that we can address without bringing in these other actors. Private sector, for example, civil society, NGOs, think tank, working groups like that, developing working groups. We had a chance to see that. One of the things I also worked on was something called global health security agenda when I was in government. And the concept of that was to figure out how we as a global community can work together to address global infectious disease issues. And by doing that, we not only were able to bring in 64 countries to work on a global effort, but we also started to work with private sector and NGOs as well. And in addition to that, we started working with multilateral organizations like the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, Organization of Animal Health. We work with the World Bank, the European Union, African Union, ECOWAS, a number of entities. And it's been around since 2014, but the fundamental aspect of it, the fundamental thing we learned is that if you're going to deal with a global threat, whether it's, no matter what it is, and there's a number of categories of global threats we're dealing with, you have to bring in the different actors, and it has to be global, and it has to be deliberate, and it takes time and care and energy. And as I said, it's still existing now, it has 64 countries to it, but the concept is very closely related to this idea that to do these things, you have to have a different approach, which includes different actors who all play a role, even actors if you don't think they play a role. And it's also a whole government approach, because you have all the different departments and agencies within a government that play a role in those issues, sitting around the table and also providing their input on how we address these issues.
I actually think we've been lazy on hate, okay, just generally in our country and around the world. And the money that needs to be spent in the soft power domain is so small compared to what we spend on the kinetic aspects. Your point, Madam Ambassador, around the other players that partner with us. We've been very slow on the uptake. We keep thinking on the radicalization piece that it's just the technology companies that need to do more. So when we talk about the corporate sector, we only tend to talk about the tech companies. The argument I make in my book, there's a very long subtitle to my book, How We Win, is that we cannot win if it's only government that's doing this. There are a lot of things that the private sector largely can do, and most of it is partnering with their data and their expertise with the non-government organizations who are actually the frontline workers who are doing this work. So when you talk about how do we see a government, both the private sector, philanthropists, NGOs, that actually get serious the way we would about an infectious disease or about climate change, you can't do it all if we just wait for government to do it. And I think that's what I meant when I said the 21st century is different than anything else. There are new models available to us. The U.S. government is very slow on the uptake to understand what it might be. I look at an organization like, I look at a threat like Ebola, or that's more recent. But if we looked at HIV/AIDS when it came to the world in the 1980s, we understood that if government was the only entity that was working on how to stop that virus, we would be still dealing with a problem today. What ended up happening was philanthropists and educators and on and on and on began to say, what can we do to educate, to inoculate, to teach people differently, to pour money into research? That's the kind of approach we need, not just for the issue of radicalization and extremism, but a lot of other, as you rightly said, global threats that we're facing. And we talk about it, but we haven't instituted a way forward to make that happen. And I think, frankly, that movement for change isn't going to happen inside of government. It is going to require somebody on the outside to say, I'm taking this on, and this is how we're going to do it.
Interesting. Here's what I'd like to do now. As fill-in moderator, I've kind of reached the point where I need kind of the phone-a-friend section, as I'll put it. So let's go to you. We have microphones. Do you kind of know the drill? Please let us know who you are and help me out here. I see one right back here. Let's start here. I'll try to kind of get a diversity of questions in here and questioners if I can. Then we're going to go to the cadet next, but yep.
John Mealy from MOA. Thanks for the description of the problem. I'm interested in finding out, as Mr. Sanger pointed out in his book, some examples that you have uncovered either in your FBI work or your ambassador work. What are the counter threats that have been identified and either blocked or investigated? I just got a feeling that you all talked about the lack of and the need to reorganize and players, but I'd like to know what has been found out about the current domestic.
But then you won't read my book.
He will. But he wants you to give a couple of examples. I think it's a good example.
Depending on your answer, I might buy it.
Well, can you pick out an example, something that you've grabbed a hold of?
So I'll just, two quick things, sir. One is, in the kind of threat that I deal with on young Muslims who are getting radicalized, you can't have a solution if you don't know what the problem is and why they get radicalized. The issue of identity and belonging is the central pillar for millennials and Generation Z. So everything builds from that. Toward that end, what do we know works? Local solutions, not from the top down, but from community out. Peers, peer-to-peers, convincing them not to join into that us versus them ideology can come in many ways. One example of that, and the most successful, is former extremists who are able to work one-on-one with their peers to say, I went down that path, this didn't work. We, the United States government, partnered in the Bush administration with Google and 2 other foundations to build something called the Against Violent Extremism Network, the AVE network. It has 400 right now, it should be grown, former extremists who were able to mine their content and use that content in ways to influence the young people in communities. The problem, sir, is not that we don't have the solutions. The problem is we have not, 18 years after 9/11, scaled the solutions. So it's not a question of, I wish we knew what to do. It's the question of how do you take these dozens and dozens of programs like this one and make it happen 24/7 so that the many touch points that those kids get in their daily life is moving their behavior in a particular way.
And for me, I mean, I talked a little bit already about the global health security agenda. I mean, that is a model that's working. The problem is it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of funding, it takes a lot of commitment by government, non-governmental entities to make it happen. And sometimes there's not an interest in the government to invest in something like that. As I said, it's been around since 2014. And it was actually launched a month before Ebola happened. So when Ebola happened, there was a lot of recognition about, yes, we really do need something global to try to deal with infectious disease. And the process that we did, that we went through to make it happen is time intensive. We had to have meetings with countries to sit down and figure out an action plan for how we're actually going to do it. We developed these something called the JEEs, which are ways in which we can go into a country to develop understand what is their baseline in terms of being able to deal with infectious disease. As I said, there's a lot of regular interactions with all the multilateral organizations. There's ministerial meetings every year. There's steering group meetings 3 times a year just to keep this thing going. It's a big investment, and unfortunately, the U.S. doesn't always like to do those kind of things. We don't like to invest in these long-term strategies. In fact, after we were able, as a government, to go to Congress and get funding for this effort, when Zika happened, they took money away from that overall effort. So rather than finding more money to deal with an immediate situation, they took money from the long-term strategy. So we are sometimes our own worst enemy because we don't plan. We don't have a way of really, our mindset, our structure is not that way in which we can plan way ahead to deal with some of these threats. But there is a model. There's other models out there as well in ways we can do this. We just have to be ready to take on what it takes to address these things.
So from the FBI's perspective, more of an investigative response to your question. Right now, we have roughly, just for a data reference, we have roughly about 5,000 terrorism investigations in the United States. And of that, 850 are centered around domestic terrorism, and then another 1,000 are centered around the homegrown violent extremist threat. So it goes back to my opening point about those 2 buckets. Now, what keeps me up at night, and probably most people in this room, a subset of that is when it's too late, and that's a mass shooting. And so we always are wanting to posture ourselves to get in front of mass shooting. And so what we do throughout the Bureau is continue to build those relationships, create a culture of collaboration and information sharing with our local and state partners. I'll give you one quick vignette to kind of give you an idea of what right looks like. Last month, after the Dayton shooting, we had an individual in Connecticut resident. He had reached out for his relative in another state, asked her would she take some magazines to her address. That didn't sound right. She called it in. It got to, the FBI, got to Connecticut. We worked with the Norwalk PD, found out who that individual was, and as luck would have it, not only Norwalk PD was aware of this individual, they knew about his history. So we worked jointly with that, and were able to execute a search warrant under the authorities from the Norwalk PD, and we're able, and since I see some head nods, some of these people in the state, some in the room probably heard about this, but you know, had some body armor, had some weapons, had a lot of ammunition. You can never say you prevented it, but you can. So that's what we're trying to do to get ahead of the threat. And then on the back end of that, continue to try to replicate that cycle of cooperation.
Can I just have one more response?
Sure.
I'll be quick so they have other questions. Just to give another example that's closer to the issue I started talking about. Between 2010 and 2016, we had something called the Nuclear Security Summits. We had 4 of them. And the goal of the Nuclear Security Summits was to attack the threat of vulnerable nuclear material and try to secure that material to prevent, as I said, non-state actors getting their hands on that material. And we recognized that this was a global threat. And one of the reasons why it was successful is because we were able to get around the table countries who don't normally talk to each other, particularly on nuclear issues. So we had India, Israel, Pakistan around the table. We had countries that don't normally talk to each other anyway. You know, we had Armenia, Azerbaijan around the table. But they were all over, 50 countries were around the table, all focused on this issue because they realized that that was something more important than their disputes about other things. Of course, we had to keep the issues of nonproliferation out of it because then you get into a whole nother can of worms. That's been a problem for that treaty. But in very similar way that we did with the global security agenda, we had these regular summits. We had a lot of work in between the summits with the different entities, different government representatives from the different governments. We had action plans rather than action packages, action plans. We had country commitments. We had all types of things that were done. And that's another example, though, of dealing with a threat, a global threat, but the work that you have to do to make it happen. So I just wanted to throw a different example that's more on the hard security side.
You ask these practitioners for examples, and they give you examples. And I want to ask you for more questions. Let's try to collect at least 2 or 3 at a time. Now, I said I was coming to the cadet next. I'll give you a chance if you still have a question. Okay, so let's have her first. I haven't, anybody over here? I haven't come, okay, back here. So there's 1, 2, and then let's go further back 3. So 1, 2, 3, and then we'll see if we can go for more after that. Please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. My name is Cadet Dana Cody. I'm obviously from the United States Military Academy at West Point. And you have kind of already addressed my question, but I'm going to try and tailor it so that we can keep the conversation going forward. But in 2018, the FBI had discovered a terrorist cell, I believe in New Mexico, where there were several youths found in that arena that had, the intent was clear that they were intended to be radicalized. And so with that frame of reference in mind, also with the extreme amount of mass shootings happening recently and the ease of access to weapons in this country, I guess my question is, what can we do to mitigate the ability for non-state actors, both on the Islamic side and homegrown radicalization with the far right, how can we minimize the ability for non-state actors to radicalize youth, especially with their extreme access to weapons in the country? Thank you.
Okay, so that's 1. We have 1 over here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Alicia Yale University Macmillan Center for Area and International Studies. My question is kind of looking at building relationships with the Muslim communities in particular. So after 9/11, we see unprecedented surveillance on the Muslim community. We see informers being sent into the communities. We see the creation of this note of adding Muslim Americans on the no-fly list. And I think for a lot of communities, they feel like they're being unfairly targeted by law enforcement. So I'm wondering, what do you think the strategies are to rebuild that relationship when a lot of the community feels as though they've been violated or their privacy has been violated?
Okay, that's 2. And then we had 1 in the back.
Tammy, I'm a recent graduate from the University of Hartford. Can you hear me? Okay.
We can hear you.
I was wondering, so we've established that the focus is ideological, and I was wondering if there was a specific focus on region or on specific individuals or groups, because the groups are constantly merging and changing names and changing their association.
Okay, I think I see some commonality in those questions. Who wants to jump in first?
Well, I'll jump on first. So to recognize your question, it kind of goes right back to what I said before about we're a law enforcement agency as well as a domestic intelligence agency. And so there are some parallels and other sides to the FBI that I've seen in my career. Here in Connecticut and throughout a lot of inner cities in the country, questions always asked, what makes a young man or woman join a street gang? And when you peel that back, you see that there's some circumstances in which young people grow up in that kind of make them more vulnerable to being recruited. So taking that in mind and going out again, going back to Farah's point, trying to be proactive and build relationships with the young people, not only the older generation, but people in the younger people in the various communities, to have a viewpoint of at least having a freedom of choices. We have extensive community outreach programs throughout the United States and all the various field offices to try to open up that dialogue with young people. And then to the young lady from Yale University, that's a great question. I'm literally right down the street from you on State Street, so I'd be more than happy to talk to you offline. But perception is always reality for a lot of people. But I can assure you, at least here in New Haven, our community outreach program for various communities, not just the standard minority communities, we're always finding ways to try to open up new lanes of dialogue. So I'd like to talk to you offline. Maybe we can talk about that.
I'll let you go first since it's more your...
Well, I thought all three questions were really excellent, and I was really happy that three women asked questions, I have to say. So I'll just say a couple of things. First is engagement is essential, not in a time of crisis, but in a time of non-crisis. And to your point, no one can do their job in a time of crisis if you haven't built the kinds of relationships, steady relationships, open relationships that allow you to know who is in your community. And so we tend to find stereotypical, outreach sometimes, thinking those are the places that I need to go because everybody tells you that those are the places you need to go. I was really lucky when I was special representative to Muslim communities for our country that when I was traveling around the world, I traveled to nearly 100 countries on behalf of our nation. I pushed back against embassies who said to me, here are the groups of people that you should be meeting. And I'd say, how many times have you met with them before? Well, there are steady people that we meet. And I'd say, well, I want to meet the people you haven't met. So ask them to come. It's fine that they can come, but ask them to bring 2 other entities that have never stepped foot in front of a US government person before, so that we can expand our network, we can understand. It isn't a question, in my mind, of convincing a community to love you, to say that everything that we, the United States, stands for is the right thing. That isn't the job with relationship building. It's to open up your ability to have a conversation in a steady way. It's to have a dignified and engaging conversation so that you can learn from them and they can learn from you. So that's the first thing I'd say, and I know that works because we did that, and it's how we built some programs. And even in the hardest and toughest moments of our foreign policy, we were able to build relationships with communities that said the same thing that the woman from Yale said, which is, you're targeting us because we happen to be Muslim and you think that there's something wrong with Islam. And to be able to start from that point and actually build out the capacity to say, let us tell you the kinds of things that we want to do. And I think, I will say, I know, the greatest strength of the United States government in terms of relationship building is to be the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner with the ideas that you hear on the ground. The US government doesn't have the answers to the problems on how to build resilience. But we cannot know what those answers are if we're not talking to what the communities have to say. Some part of Connecticut, one community is going to say, this is going to really work. Another part of Connecticut is going to say something else is going to really work. How can we make that happen? So that's where I look at when I look at how to build resilience, how to fortify, how to do the non-kinetic stuff. It is all the stuff that you know about listening skills. But then there's one other piece. I'm sorry because it's so important. If we cannot get to a place where we are able to educate Americans about what the threat is in a way that makes them understand why it is government is doing what they're doing, we will never win. And so, we ran into this huge problem with the misperception that we were scaling the threat of Al-Qaeda recruitment or scaling the threat of the bad guys trying to go after Muslim youth. And I'd say, you know what? The so-called Islamic State is not running after Christians and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists at this moment. They are running after young Muslims under the age of 30 to build their armies. So let us tell you how they're trying to do that, what they're doing online and what they're doing offline, and you help us tell us, for all of us, Muslim Americans and non-Muslim Americans, what can we do to fortify? And that goes for neo-Nazis, that goes for white supremacists, that goes for everyone. You have to educate parents, you have to educate students, you have to educate communities on the tactics of the bad guys so that you can build resilience.
And I wanted to go last since you two are the experts on this particular issue, but I would just add, as part of my organization, I do a lot of work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the I is a very important part of it. And inclusion meaning not just having somebody here with you, it's about making them feel like they're a part of something, making them feel like they're a partner, making them feel that they're respected and that their views are respected. It's amazing how much can be accomplished when you treat people as if they're part of whatever you're doing. And when I think about these issues and I think about, global threats again, and one of the things I talk about a lot in class is how we can't address these threats unless we are inclusive of different cultures, inclusive of different viewpoints. And that to me is an important foundation of the work we need to do. So, when I hear these kind of questions, it makes me think about how the underlying thing of all the things that we need to be doing is bringing in these different voices, but listening, really including them and the outreach that we do to them, to different groups, and respecting them. So I just wanted to add that because
well, I want to work in a final round of questions. It'll probably need to be a lightning round. I think the questions were answered. I did have one, the cadet asked about Mexico in particular. Is there any points to be made? How are we doing with our North American neighbors? Anything in particular, Mexico, or any points to make about how we're doing with our North American neighbors and taking things on?
Well, when you go north and south of the border, it's an international nexus there, and within the FBI we have a legal attaché program where we have FBI folks that are in both of those countries, and in advancing the FBI's mission of protecting Americans from terrorist threats. Those folks are sitting continuously working with those host nation partners to facilitate the information exchange that I discussed with you earlier, as well as any threats that may be emanating outside that. So again, the common theme here is to make sure that we're really pushing a culture of collaboration. And I want to give one alibi in there because we're human beings all in this room, right? And I think that sometimes from an agency perspective with the FBI, sometimes you walk in and you just want to have a conversation with somebody. People get the boogeyman look on their face and their eyebrows raised. Look, I just want to talk to you. We're finding ourselves trying to hold more on that human element in there, building that human capital, building those relationships. When you wait till boom happens, it's too late. So that's something that I wanted to put out. That's really kind of a priority within our agency, is to continue to try to build up those relationships.
Okay, lightning round. Do we have more questions? I have one over here. We'll go right, left, and middle. Okay. Got to make them quick. We only have a few minutes or we'll get the hook.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Robert Sanders. I'm the chair of the National Security Department at the University of New Haven, U.S. Navy JAG Corps Captain retired. As I listen to your conversation here, I think about a fundamental part of the U.S. government's policy used to be development of rule of law in many of these nations around the world. I see that as falling away, and I also see our fundamental activities in our own country, some that the young lady just mentioned, non-judicial killings of people of color, etc., is detrimental to that. What do you say to that as a way to go forward, and how to reestablish soft power?
Okay. Don't have one over on the left anymore? Oh, I only got 1 minute. It's going to be real super quick.
Okay.
I've got the hook coming out.
My name is Cynthia Balbuga. I am on the board of the World Affairs Council, and my company, Veterans Advantage, is one of the sponsors. My question is, what role do you think economics plays in the breeding of extremism?
Okay. So we have rule of law, economics, all the real easy ones here. One more, and then we're going to have to keep it quick, but I think this is worthwhile to get these in.
You have discussed
Oh, the mic's coming to you just there, sir.
You've discussed all these activities, but the wherewithal involves arms. What are we doing about arming these people, or what are we not doing about arming them?
So I kind of heard rule of law, economics, and arms are means. I mean, we could have a whole 3 separate panels on that, but points, observations in the 1 or 2 minutes we have left.
I would say to your point about economics, it's a tier 2 issue. Nobody believes that, but poverty and economics do not make a terrorist, okay? You get radicalized around issues of identity and belonging. And the only other thing I'd say, because I think that they're combined, soft power can't work if you don't have an American public that requires our government leaders to use soft power. And I would say Congress, as well as the executive branch, needs to get behind using the non-kinetic capabilities that we have. You haven't seen the money invested in the departments of state or DHS to use soft power. So how are we supposed to do that?
As far as the economic piece, it talks about the point that I mentioned earlier. That's one of the challenges with homegrown violent extremists is there is no profile. We've seen individuals who come from wealthy families, who come from poor families. So, the response to that particular question is we don't have a profile. And sir, to your point about the rule of law, I mean, I think that, we continue, obviously, our director works with the Attorney General on talking on some of those points. So I hate to say this one, that's kind of above my pay grade, but I'll leave it at one there.
And I would just say that in agreement, we do have a mechanism for soft power. The question is how much we are using it now. And I think that you will see of the 3 Ds, development, diplomacy, and defense, it's the defense that's really getting a lot more attention right now. There's a lot of unhappy things happening in the State Department, for example, the lack of morale, the number of people who are leaving, the expertise we're losing, mainly because a lot of them feel as if they're not being used and respected and able to do a lot of what they have been hired to do. So we're losing a lot of that. And if we're talking about this issue about global threats, when we think about how we deal with these issues, a lot of these cannot be dealt with a military. A lot of these issues are not issues that a military can fix. A lot of them are diplomacy and development. You look at the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. We're talking about development to deal with a lot of these global threats we are worried about today. And a lot of these things will be dealt with by diplomacy and working with other countries and working with international organizations. And so while we still need a strong defense, of course, we need a strong defense, we have to recognize that the other 2 Ds are very important if we're not only going to maintain what we have today, but if we're going to be addressing these global threat issues that we have to deal with in the future.
I think the phone a friend session was successful. I appreciate your help. The good news is we have General Allen batting cleanup here shortly as well. How about a big round of applause for our panel? Thank you.